Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. Today's show focuses on Otis Redding. If you're wondering why I'm doing a show about a Georgia-born soul singer, you might not be aware that Redding died tragically in Madison on December 10th, 1967. And it's still a topic of conversation in Madison, a sort of local legend. When I asked a friend of mine for some show ideas this summer, the death of Otis Redding was the first thing he suggested as we were having a beer, looking out onto the lake where Redding's plane had crashed many years ago. I tried to sort out this local legend with Jonathan Gould, whose comprehensive musical biography, Otis Redding, An Unfinished Life, was published earlier this year. Gould is a former professional musician and author of another book, Can't Buy Me Love, The Beatles, Britain, and America. He lives in New York, where I caught up with him by phone. I thought maybe the place to start is to go to 1967 in the year leading up to Otis Redding's death. I was kind of like, where was he at in his career at that time?
Well, part of what makes I guess his death so poignant, it has to do with the fact that he was really on the cusp of sort of a major, I think, a major new step in his career in terms of his own work, his own music, and his own success with a new audience. What had happened in the year before he died was that he had really kind of broken through intentionally. I mean, they had talked about this, he and his brain trust, which consisted of Phil Walden, his manager, and Jerry Wexler, who was the vice president of Atlantic Records, and really sort of in many ways the dominant figure in the world of Southern soul music in the 1960s as Aretha Franklin's producer, and Atlantic, of course, distributed Stax Records, which was Otis's label. But in the year before his death, Otis had basically had two extremely successful European tours, one in France and England, and another in England, France, and Scandinavia, that established himself in many ways as the most important American R&B singer in the minds of most Europeans. He had gotten tremendous sort of press from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who were, extolled his talent and his records. And then, of course, he had appeared at the Monterey Pop Festival, which was kind of the great coming out party for the new rock culture in 1967. It was designed to be that, and it succeeded beyond anybody's wildest dreams in terms of establishing the idea of rock music as a serious art form in America. And Otis was one of the very few African American performers at the festival. And Otis had really had just commanded the audience at that festival. In the worst possible circumstances, he went on late on Saturday night. He was the headliner, but he went on late. There was a curfew that had already expired. It was raining lightly. He had to cut his set in half, essentially, because the local authorities were threatening to shut the whole thing down. And despite all of this, he just gave one of the greatest performances of his life, and sort of blew everybody away. I mean, they'd never seen anything like it. The famous statement that Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead made was that he said that he was pretty sure that he'd seen God on stage, and that kind of summed up the level of reaction. So as a result of all of this success, Otis was really poised to become probably the first, maybe one could say along with Hendrix, the first African-American singer and songwriter and record maker to really establish himself with this new audience for what was then called, what started to be called rock, as opposed to rock and roll, or pop, as it had been called for the early years of the Beatles' success. But this audience that the Beatles had brought into being, that bought record albums rather than singles, and regarded this music to be in some ways, the most important cultural force in their lives, I guess is the best way to describe it.
So he's having some success touring and kind of getting recognition. And moving into in the year in December of 1967, he ends up in the studio. He's recording.
Otis in the summer of along with everybody else in the world, spent a lot of time in the summer of 1967 listening to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was this, the sort of apotheosis of the new album art form that the Beatles and Dylan and a number of other people had brought into being over the previous 3 or 4 years. He was very taken with this record, and he made a study of it. He made a great statement to his manager, Phil Walden. He said, "I'm going to figure out what it is that everybody thinks is so great about these guys," and he did just that. As a result of the influence of that, of understanding the techniques that went into making that record and some of the conceptual ideas behind that record, Otis, in the fall of 1967, really resolved to make some real changes in the way that he went about making records. Previously, making records was something that he fit into gaps in his tour schedule. One of his greatest albums, Otis Blue, which came out in 1965, was literally recorded, the entire record, in one sort of 24-hour session, because that was all the time that he had. He had to leave Memphis the next day to go play a gig someplace. And that gives some sense of the way in which, of the nature of his priorities. Until the 1960s and the mid-1960s, most black R&B stars or soul singers, most of their income came from live performances. What income they produced, that they received that came from records, came from selling singles, not albums. So the very idea of putting large amounts of time into making, let's say, a record album was very new and very questionable, to R&B musicians of that generation. So the other thing that happened to him in the fall was he had to have a throat operation. He had polyps on his vocal cords, which is a very, very common malady for singers, not just soul singers. Opera singers get them. Anybody who uses their voice a great deal is prone to this. And there was some question about how the surgery would go, but as it turned out, after a period in which he was literally not just forbidden to sing, but forbidden to talk for a number of weeks, which he spent recuperating at home, he was essentially housebound. He couldn't speak at first, and he spent all of his time with a guitar and a tape recorder and pads of paper, writing this whole crop of new songs that reflected some of the influence of the new music that he was listening to. And then when he was finally allowed to sing, it turned out that his voice was stronger and more supple than it had ever been. Everybody was thrilled with it, Otis most of all. And so when indeed he was given permission to sing, he essentially set aside 3 weeks of time. It probably would have gone on longer had it not been for the accident, where he just started working at the Stax studio in Memphis. He would go there 5 days a week, and they would spend the whole time recording. They couldn't get over the sound of how good his voice sounded. And anyway, he wound up recording close to 18, we don't know exactly, but close to 16 or 18 new songs. He also re-recorded his vocals on some material that he had recorded earlier in the year, again, because his voice sounded so much better that he wanted to redo the vocals on some of this. That's where things stood on December 10th, when on that weekend when he went off to play 3 gigs, one at Vanderbilt, one in Nashville, and one in Cleveland, and then was flying to the gig in Madison when he died. And what he left behind was this incredible trove of unmixed and in some cases unfinished tracks, which Stax and Atlantic Records were able to put into many cases finished form or something close to it and released over the next few years. But of course, the jewel of all of those was Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, this contemplative ballad, which was had no precedent in Otis's work. He had never written a song like this. He'd never written a song that was as lyrically accomplished as that song was. He'd never written a song that had the sort of contemplative air that song has. And I always urge people to, if they're wondering what where that came from, I urge them to listen to the last track on Sgt. Pepper, A Day in the Life, which is also a contemplative ballad that has a kind of a very sort of wistful opening. And I think that in some ways, Sitting on the Dock of the Bay was Otis's homage to that incredible recording, which of course a lot of people, A Day in the Life would suggest is one of, if not, the sort of most extraordinary tracks from that whole era.
One of the most iconic parts of that song is him whistling. What's the story behind the whistling?
Well, initially, the feeling is that there are two recorded tracks that we know of that song. There may be more, but if so, they've been lost in the archives of the Stax Record Company. And on the first one, he gets to the end, and you can tell this is not. They know this is not a finished version of this song. This is a work in progress. He messes up the lyrics at, in certain points of the verses, and he's trying to figure out this and that. And it's a typical sort of first or second take. Gets to the end of it, and he, in the absence of anything else, sort of whistles this melody. Now, one of the important things about Otis is that Otis functioned as the arranger on virtually all of his recordings, and particularly the arranger of the horns on his recordings. So what one would normally assume would happen at the end of this song would be that there would be some kind of a horn chorus there. And Otis may have been sort of suggesting, by whistling the tune, suggesting what that horn chorus might be. But it's sort of funny because what happens at the end is after that take, the engineer, you can hear him on the talkback. He says, Otis, you're not going to make it as a whistler because the whistling is pretty bad. Okay. It would appear that what happened is that they did another take of it, and Otis cleaned up his whistling. But since this song was mixed and released after he died, there are a lot of other possibilities. What's going on there? One possibility, of course, was that if Otis had lived, they wouldn't have left the whistling on. They might indeed have had a horn chorus there. Perhaps he thought the whistling is kind of perfect. And in a record that really also sort of serves as his epitaph, his self-written epitaph, it's enormously affecting to have really sort of this sense of him almost sort of leaving the stage. I mean, in a much larger sense, with this gentle, beautiful sort of whistling. But I've also heard a story, which I didn't put in the book because I couldn't corroborate it. But I did speak at one time with a promo man at Atlantic Records, well known, who told me that in early January 1968, he, for one reason or another, was walking through the Atlantic Studios in New York, and Tom Dowd, their great engineer, was sitting at the console there, and there was this whistling that he was mixing. And of course, at this point, nobody had heard Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. And what Dowd told this promo man was that they wanted to put this whistling on the end of the record, but that the actual whistling on the tape wasn't so good, which of course would conform with the previous take that we all know on Ron Capone saying, Otis, you're not going to make it as a whistler. And that Dowd had brought in a whistler. You know what I mean? There are such a thing. There are people who are expert whistlers to do this. Now, as I say, I didn't put it in the book because I don't put anything in especially about something as important as this. I'm not going to put something like that in print unless I'm really sure of it. And I couldn't corroborate it. It's such a good story that it's the sort of thing that people naturally latch on to as one of these, well, you know what really happened sort of thing. What we do know is the whistling was Otis's idea. The question of whether that's actually him doing it or not, to me, is irrelevant in the larger scheme of things, given, as I say, the perfection of the idea on that song, and particularly in the context that song came to exist in as his epitaph. And the incredible thing about that song, or the wonderful thing about that song, is that it went on to become by far his biggest hit. It was the, so to speak, unequivocal crossover hit that he had been seeking during his whole career.
Now, obviously, he didn't get to see the success of the song, and Redding died on that plane crash. I'm wondering what you were able to find out about the crash and the events kind of leading up to the accident.
At the time, in the 1960s, I've written about that period in a number of different contexts, and I lived through that period as a child and as a teenager, so I have some kind of a visceral sort of take on it. But one of the sort of joking ideas that I have about it is that there's a certain way that nobody died by accident in the 1960s. There was, that is to say, after the Kennedy assassination in particular, the death of almost every public figure was felt to involve some sort of a conspiracy, some sort of an unseen hand. And Otis's death was no exception. When he died, very soon after he died, this sort of strange current of kind of malicious rumor attached to the circumstances of his death, the idea being that somebody had wanted him dead, somebody had tampered with his plane, or in some way or another had played a role in this. It was most, I think, troubling and affecting to the extent that one aspect of the rumor suggested that his manager, Phil Walton, who was not just his manager, Phil was also a close friend of Otis. They had come up together in a very real sense. Phil was white, Otis was black, but Phil, with great personal effort, transcended a lot of the bigotry of his upbringing, and so on and so forth. Anyway, these were two men who were devoted to one another on many different levels. But the rumor arose that that Phil might have played some role in this, with all of the usual types of fictionalized embellishment. That Otis was going to end his relationship with Phil, and that Phil, therefore, was cutting his losses. Makes no sense, by the way, on any level at all. Phil's name was on every contract that Otis ever signed, which meant that Phil would have continued to get his share of any money that Otis made, whether they were working together or not. And none of this makes any rational sense. But I bring all of this up because one of the things I wanted to do in writing the book was to come as close to as I could to presenting some kind of a definitive explanation of what might have happened on that plane. And I went to some lengths to do this. I interviewed a fellow named Henry Lowe, who was the son of a man named Jim Lowe. Jim Lowe was a kind of legend in Georgia aviation. He ran the civil aviation operation at Macon Airport. He trained Otis's pilot, who was a fellow named Dick Frazier. When Otis decided that he wanted to buy a suitable plane to fly himself and his band around, it was Jim who recommended that he get a Beech 18, which was the plane that indeed he was flying in when he died. And when I spoke with Henry, Jim Lowe is long dead, but when I spoke with Henry and interviewed him, he was a teenager at the time, but he remembers, he says, "Oh, my father felt he knew exactly what happened." And I said, "Well, what was that?" And he said that his father had said, "Well, it was a classic case of a Southern-trained pilot without a great deal of experience flying in northern winter conditions." What seems to have happened is that in making his approach to the airport at Madison, essentially what the pilot would have done, what Dick Frazier would have done, is set the coordinates in his autopilot, which the plane was equipped with, and then simply monitor the position of the plane until it came out of the clouds. The autopilot would have been set to bring it out of the clouds 200 feet above the lip of the runway, at which point Frazier would have taken manual control of the plane and landed it. That's the way this is done. But the one thing that he would not have perhaps known enough to know is that if a plane is laden with ice, the autopilot will compensate for the increased drag and the increased sort of instability of the plane automatically, without the pilot really knowing this, until the point where it can't compensate anymore. And at that point, the autopilot will shut off. And at that point, it's almost undoubtedly the case, the plane went into a stall. That is to say, the nose dropped down. They were less than 1,000 feet over the lake, and unless you were very experienced and very aware of what was happening, there would be almost no time for a pilot suddenly confronted with this situation to know what to do. In fact, the thing that any person would normally do, which is to try to pull the nose of the plane back up, that would send it into a free stall where it would just drop into the lake. And indeed, the one eyewitness account, reliable eyewitness account, describes the plane doing exactly that. It literally fell like a stone. It didn't glide into the lake. It did everything that a plane in a stall does in that way. And I was sort of able to confirm it a bit. I was able to get in touch with a pilot named Tracy Toth. And Tracy is a commercial airline pilot, but at one time in her career, she actually owned a Beech 18, and she actually flew it in and out of Truex Field in Madison, which is the airport there, as you well know. And when I ran all of this by Tracy, who, again, is familiar with the plane, familiar with the airport, familiar with the conditions that apply in Wisconsin in December, she said, "Oh, absolutely." Was a reaction to Jim Lowe's sort of speculation about what might have happened. She said, that sounds like exactly what would have happened. And so I feel fairly confident that the scenario that I've laid out in the book is accurate, with the most important thing being that this was an accident. This was not as a result of somebody tampering with the plane or some maintenance, somebody overlooking some aspect of the maintenance of the plane or the plane being overloaded. The one thing you can say, and this is figures in most civil aviation accidents, is one could probably say they shouldn't have been flying that day, that it was a mistake to make that flight in those winter conditions. But, in the world of entertainers, Otis prided himself on rarely, if ever, missing a gig, especially considering the fact that he had this powerful new plane to fly himself around in. I think that there was a sense that, why shouldn't they be able to make this flight?
It's interesting that you brought up earlier the fact that there's just kind of a lot of like speculation, a lot of like conspiracy or just kind of like an idea that something nefarious happened because, it's something that people still talk about a lot in Madison. It comes up in conversation all the time, when we're, out by the lake, or there's a plaque in Madison with,
I've seen it.
It's just kind of interesting because, we still do talk about it, but and it's kind of nice to kind of understand the cultural kind of touchstone of that period, which I hadn't really thought about before.
Well, the part of it that makes it kind of important, and this is a legacy it's a legacy of the Jim Crow era, the effect of which on Otis's career, and not to mention Phil Walden's career, and on the career of every Southern-born African-American singer of that generation before and after. But the part of it that's a legacy of that is Otis, from his side of the color line, as they used to call it in the South, and Phil from his side of the color line. There were a lot of people in Macon particularly, but elsewhere in general, who were not pleased about Otis's relationship with Phil and Phil's relationship with Otis. There were people who felt that it was, who naturally assumed that Phil was just this sort of, exploitative white manager, or that Otis was somehow doing whatever he had to do in order. There was a desire on the part of some people, one might almost say many people, on both sides of the color line, to disapprove of this. And under those circumstances, Otis's death, in their minds, became a kind of cautionary tale. Certainly from the African-American perspective, the implication was, this is what happens to a black man who puts his trust in a white man in these circumstances. And that's one of the reasons, because I think it's so unfair and because I think it's so offensive, given who these people actually were. It's one of the reasons that I felt a real need to try to dispel that sense. There were plenty of racial tensions in the relationship between Phil and Otis, and Otis and Jerry Wexler, and Otis and all of the other, and Otis and the people, Steve Cropper and Jim Stewart at Stax. The thing that a lot of whites of that period liked to say, which was that, well, we were colorblind, or Otis was colorblind. Well, that's nonsense. That's not what was going on. That's a drastic oversimplification of something. But that there was genuine good feeling, shading toward love between these people. That's also true. And I think that people want to oversimplify these sorts of stories on every different level, because the truth, which is always complex and which has a lot of ambivalence in it, is somehow less satisfying. As a biographer, I find the complexity of the truth to be the real interest in any story, but a lot of other people don't necessarily feel that way.
Now, there's some famous and morbid, I would say, photos of Redding after he was pulled from the lake. What do you make of those photos and just the fact that they exist?
I think they're an extraordinary bad. Well, I don't know. Look, there are people with, as we know, all the more in the present world, there are people with cameras everywhere. All right. The real decision is what should be published, what should be made public, and what shouldn't be made public. The photographs were first published, to my knowledge, in Jet magazine, which was an African American publication. That's to say, its audience was largely African American, and I think the publication of the photographs was in extraordinary bad taste. At the same time, Jet magazine was no stranger to bad taste. It was a kind of somewhat sensationalistic, very important, by the way, but also somewhat sensationalistic publication. Important because it was one of the very, very few very few magazines that was at that time that was directed at a black readership. But it was also, it could be pretty tawdry. There are other things that they did that were pretty tawdry too. The photographs of Otis are just so, they're just so heartbreaking in this way. I don't think there was any reason why they should have been published, but published they were. I don't know what more really can be said. It was a lapse of editorial judgment that once it happens, of course, they're available everywhere now, thanks to the internet and so on and so forth.
What was the public's reaction to his death, and also people in the music community that were fans of him? What was kind of the public's reaction to hearing the news?
Yeah, I had so many people. I have had so many people tell me that they, as with other famous deaths, they remember exactly where they were. They remember how they heard the news, where they were. There must have been, I think there must have been 20,000 people waiting in line outside the Factory in Madison, which was the club that he was due to play in, who claimed to have been in that line when they heard about this. Right? If only it would have been one of the biggest club dates of Otis's career. But I think that one of the things that I think about in relation to this is that fans have a range of feelings and a range of attitudes toward performers. And one of the qualities about Otis that I think is very important, it had to do with his music. It had to do with something about the way he looked, something about the way he conducted himself as a public figure. Otis was beloved. He was a beloved figure. What do I mean by that? Well, James Brown wasn't a beloved figure. James Brown was enormously admired. James Brown, there's a whole range of emotion that people directed at I'm just taking him as an example, at James Brown. But beloved is not a word that comes to mind in terms of most people's reaction to them. I think Otis, because of this combination of imposing physical strength and extraordinary vulnerability that he projected, occupied a very special place in the sort of pantheon of soul singers. This was a singer who had a capacity to make an extraordinary personal connection with his listeners. And so when somebody like that dies suddenly, or when that person dies suddenly, I think the feelings of loss are magnified. They're more intense. So here again, this was a singer who specialized in an interesting kind of dynamic between his sense of strength and his sense of vulnerability. And so when his vulnerability is then affirmed by this tragic death, it somehow or another fits into the whole emotional universe that he created around himself to begin with.
Could you take me back to Otis's early life? Tell me a little bit about his family's upbringing and kind of how he got into music.
Sure. Well, his parents started out as sharecroppers, as so many African-American families of their generation did. Otis was actually born in the south west corner of Georgia, outside of a town called Dawson in Terrell County. He had three older sisters. They were born in quick succession. Otis's parents, who were very hardworking, church-going, sort of people of their generation, or African Americans of their generation, shared this extraordinary faith in the idea of education that was very, very common and very affecting in that place and in that time. So they wound up moving their family to Macon, in the middle of the state, because Dawson did not have a high school for African Americans. The furthest anybody could go, the furthest a black child could go in the schools in Dawson at that time was, I think, the 7th or 8th grade, maybe. So they moved to Macon because they wanted their daughters to become teachers. And Louise Redding, who I was able to, the eldest of the daughters, who I was able to interview in the course of writing this book, she lives in Los Angeles. She more than fulfilled this aspiration. She became not just the first member of her family to graduate from high school, but also to graduate from college. And years later, the first member of her family to get a graduate degree. And so this was the orientation that Otis's parents, Otis Sr. and Fanny, had for their kids. The difference between him and his sisters was that for various reasons, he was never able to settle down in school. He viewed school as sort of a stage for his personality from a very early age, and he had an outsized personality. Everybody agrees about that. He was a very charming, very energetic, very funny, and entertaining kid. And this did not fit well into the regime of the classroom. But growing up, Otis, like most particularly Southern African American children of his generation, sang in church, and very early on formed a gospel quartet with a bunch of friends who lived in the housing project with him there. And the sort of reinforcement and approval and admiration that he got from singing, both in church and in this gospel quartet, which their father eventually started taking them around. This too was very common in that era. Little Richard, who also grew up in Macon, also sang as a kid in a gospel quartet that made the rounds of the church circuit there, and so on and so forth. That really sort of lit a fire in Otis. And what everybody who knew him as a child, and particularly as a teenager, has to say is he really was never interested in doing anything except singing. I don't think he ever considered doing anything. Now, that's not saying so much, because the opportunities that would have been available to him were almost non-existent at the time. But he was one of these people, and I've heard this said about a lot of people in different fields. He had a way of sabotaging every other possibility besides singing. In other words, he would get a decent job. His wife Zelma, his widow Zelma, tells a story about how he got a job working as an orderly in a hospital. After a short time there, he was, the story goes, he was singing in the elevator, and a physician, this would have been a white physician, asked him to keep his voice down, and Otis didn't like that very much, and according to Zelma, he slapped this doctor. That was the end of his job, of course. It's a kind of indication of the way, as I say, that he seemed to sabotage every viable possibility except the possibility of singing.
And what was kind of his big break in leading to him becoming a successful artist?
Well, the big break was something that could have been written by a third-rate screenwriter in Hollywood. There's no other way to describe it. Otis was the singer in a band that was led by a guy named Johnny Jenkins, who was a guitar player, a very flamboyant guitar player. And by this time, Otis was maybe 19 or almost 20 years old. And he had some, I won't say success. He had made some records. He'd gone out to California in 1960 and made a couple of records out there with a superb band. But the records went nowhere. And he had also made a record in Macon shortly before this, with a sort of a pickup band of white musicians, largely white musicians, who barely knew what they were doing. And this was a record that was put out. It was called Shout Bamalama. And it was as the title suggests, it was a pure Little Richard imitation. But Otis was playing was singing in Johnny Jenkins's band, and Johnny Jenkins's band was a sort of big hit on the fraternity circuit. Phil Walden was booking them, and through a fairly complicated course of events that involved an Atlantic Records promo man named Joe Galkin set up a session at Stax Records in Memphis. For Johnny Jenkins, who was an instrumentalist, of course. And so he came up with this idea that Johnny Jenkins would record with the Stax Rhythm section, Booker T and the MGs, and that Otis would drive Johnny to Memphis for the session. And that at some point in the session, Galkin would mention to Jim Stewart, who was a friend of his, and Stewart prevailed on Galkin for advice, because Galkin was a very experienced record guy. Galkin would say to Stewart, "Well, Johnny's driver is also his singer. Why don't we see what he can do?" So that was the setup, and what added to it in terms of the third-rate screenwriting was that Johnny sort of fell apart during the session. There's a lot of question as to how good a guitarist Johnny really was. He was a very flamboyant. He was a fabulous performer. But what seems to have happened is that he got together with this very accomplished band at Stax, and they were really not particularly impressed with what he was doing at all. And the general feeling is that as he got the message that they were not exactly as thrilled with him as the fraternity boys and girls at the University of Georgia tended to be, he really kind of fell apart. And at a certain point, Jim Stewart, the owner and engineer at Stax, turned to Joe Galkin. He said, I just can't make a record with this guy. I think we need to stop. And of course, that was Galkin's opportunity to say, well, the Johnny's driver is also his singer. Why don't we see what we can do with that? And to add to the drama a little bit, the first song they recorded, we're almost sure, although the records are not exact about this, was yet another Little Richard imitation, a song called Hey Hey Baby. After they record it once or twice, Stewart says to Galkin, he says, well, I don't think the world is waiting for the next second coming of Little Richard, to tell you the truth. I mean, that was a very dated sound by 1962, which is when this was taking place. And so Galkin, ever resourceful, says, well, he's also got a ballad that he wants, that he can sing. And Otis started to sang the opening verse of These Arms of Mine, because the song was so slow, and it was so you couldn't imitate Little Richard on a song like that. And so what everybody heard on that recording, or in that studio and on that recording, really sort of for the first time was the voice that Otis Redding actually had when he wasn't trying to imitate somebody else. It was an extraordinary voice. I always compare it to something similar happened in Elvis's first session. It wasn't going well. It was a bit of a disaster, in fact, and everybody was very nervous and didn't know quite what to do. And at a certain point in that session, Elvis started to clown around on this blues that he'd heard on the radio called That's All Right Mama. And everybody went, wait a minute, what's that? And it's very interesting the way before the era of home recording equipment, and when it was very rare that anybody had a way of recording the sound of their own voice, there's this way that oftentimes singers hearing their voice in a studio, well recorded on playback, would have this kind of moment of self-recognition. And that's sort of what happened, I think, with Elvis, and I think that's what happened with Otis at Stax that day. To actually hear his voice that way, it seems to have had a profound effect on him. That's the beginning of both the voice and sort of the vocal personality that we know as Otis Redding.
Looking back, now 50 years later after his career ended, where does he fit in music history? What do you make of his career and the impact that it had?
Well, in terms of sort of where he fits, there's kind of a pantheon. Otis's generation of African-American singers, virtually all of whom were church-trained, church-bred, I guess is the best way to describe them, in part because the church occupied such an important position in African-American social life in that period. And they were all exposed to this new form of what we now think of as gospel music. That generation, because of their musical education, I think, in the black church, really was the greatest generation of black voices that we've ever had in popular music. The oldest member of it, was Ray Charles. The youngest member of that generation, as I conceive of it, was Stevie Wonder. And Otis falls in between, but we're talking about Sam Cooke, and we're talking about James Brown and Marvin Gaye, and the queen of them all, Aretha Franklin, who was the apotheosis of the whole thing in some ways. Otis exists in that pantheon. There's that dimension of it. But the other aspect of his career that I think is of his legacy, I guess you could say, has to do with the fact that he, unlike some of those people, wrote most of his own material, was moving toward writing all of his own material. So as a songwriter, as a producer, as an arranger, Otis really anticipated what Sly Stone and Marvin Gaye and most of all Stevie Wonder went on to do in the late 1960s and early 1970s on these self-produced albums that they made that really established them as pop superstars. So I think that the legacy of these black artists who really function in the way that groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones did as auteurs, who are making records in which the final say about what goes out and what happens, what doesn't happen, what gets released, what doesn't get released, that I think is sort of, in some ways, the most powerful ongoing legacy of Otis's career. The other thing that I've started to think about, I mean, I wrote about it in the book, but I think the importance of it is striking me as greater and greater. It's a historical thing, but before the rock and roll era of the mid-1950s, it's very hard for any modern audience to understand that it was simply unacceptable. It was taboo for an African-American man to behave in a sexualized manner in front of a white audience in America. It wasn't just that it was frowned upon. It was, in many cases, actionable. Otis was born in 1941. Emmett Till was born in 1941. Emmett Till may or may not have whistled at a white woman in a small town in the South, and it cost him his life. And that was not uncommon in that way. So a sort of continuing legacy of soul singers, particularly of the 1960s, has to do with this idea of breaking that taboo. It started in the 50s with people like Ray Charles and Fats Domino and Little Richard, but they were all keyboard players. They all played behind their piano players. They played behind keyboards. They were sort of tethered to the instrument in this way. It's different with a singer, and Otis was in a very natural way, in an unscripted way, very unlike the Motown groups or great singer-dancers like James Brown or Jackie Wilson, or these sort of suave personalities like onstage personalities like Sam Cooke. Otis was aggressively sexual on stage, and it had a huge impact on his audiences. I mean, what few reviews of his performances found their way into things like the New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle and mainstream papers of the time are really fixated on just how eroticized his performance is on stage. that was a huge step forward. I mean, we yeah, as I say, we take it so for granted in the world of Jay-Z and Kanye West, that a black man can, so to speak, behave this way on stage. But at the time, it was a real breakthrough. And there was a sort of revolutionary aspect to it, because what it was doing was sort of presenting the eroticism that had been latent in black music all along, and in some ways in black culture all along. That was no small thing in 1965.
What did Otis Redding mean to you, just as a person who loves music, and why did you want to write the book?
Well, I came up listening to his music, groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and their obvious influence by that. And then in my own life, I spent many years as a musician. I'm a drummer. The Stax rhythm section is quite simply, or was and is, the gold standard of a certain type of R&B rhythm section. There's a Stax rhythm section, there's Motown's rhythm section, there's James Brown's rhythm section. That's the A, B, and C of on a rhythmic level of all the popular music. I'm starting to say that anybody listens to now. So I loved the band that Otis recorded with, and most of all, however, I loved his voice. I loved his whole sensibility. I loved that devotional quality that he had. The humor that seemed always to be sort of lurking under the surface of anything that he sang about, however heartfelt, however sad. To me, one of the great messages of rhythm and blues that makes it so different from the pre-war blues, what people think of as the classic blues, country blues like Robert Johnson or even Bessie Smith. Rhythm and blues presents romantic relations in a sort of implicitly comic context. There's always some sort of sense, isn't it somehow ridiculous that we feel this strongly? So I was enormously drawn to all of those qualities. And when an editor suggested to me that after writing a book about the Beatles, I should write a book about soul music, I thought to myself, well, what's the absolute quintessence of that? I mean, to use that word. What distills the qualities that I love about soul music, or rather, who distills them more than anyone else? And the answer was Otis. And nobody had written at that time what I think of as a serious musical biography of him. And that's sort of what I do. I focus on people's work. I don't focus that much on their personal lives, except as it influences the work, which sometimes can be considerable, of course. And I thought, well, this is a subject that this is a singer who's deserving of a book, and nobody has really done it right yet. So that was how that's how I came to it.
You mentioned earlier that you've been to Madison. You've seen the plaque that's dedicated to Otis Redding. Could you tell me a little bit about that trip? And I don't know.
Oh, it was very brief. I just felt like I should see the actual circumstances. Research is this process of developing much more information, God knows, than you're actually going to use. But you want to, in some way or another, contextualize anything that you can contextualize. So I was there for really just about a day and a half. I looked at the lake. I looked at the plaque. I was disappointed that it was a sunny day, because I wanted it to be, I wanted to be low cloud cover and all of this sort of thing, so I could experience that. And that was about the extent of it. But it was, I just wanted to, you just want to see the thing that you're, in that case, that I knew I would be writing about at some point or another. But I'm impressed with the fact that Madison has kind of, my feeling is, my sense is that really has kind of embraced this as part of its history in an interesting way. There's a reporter there named, I think his name is Doug Moe, mm-hmm. who wrote a terrific article about, sort of the circumstances of Otis's, of the plane crash. Really it's the one seriously reported article. But he was able to speak with people like a good the way a good newspaper reporter, does. He spoke with the cops. Some of whom actually were involved in the rescue operation and the subsequent investigation. There was real intrigue about the fact. I mean, Otis. I'm sort of stealing Doug's thunder here by talking about this, although I do mention it in the book. But the standard at that time was that with any booking was that half the amount of the booking of the guarantee would be paid in advance, and the other half of the booking would be paid in cash on the night of the show. So Otis had been they'd done a show at Vanderbilt in Nashville, and then they had gone on to Cleveland and done a show at Leo's Casino there. That meant that Otis Otis did have a briefcase containing, I don't know, depending on what the final receipts were, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000, let's say. That briefcase vanished in the course of the investigation into the crash. Somebody in the Madison Police Department told Doug Moe, if I'm quoting from memory from his article years ago, said, "You want to know the story?" He says, "You want to know what happened to that briefcase? You're not going to find out." was basically the way it was put.
Yeah, I remember reading that article. It's a great piece by Doug. He's a great writer around here. Definitely enjoyed it.
That's my sense. Yeah, that's my sense.
Is there anything else that you want to mention about Otis or the book?
I think one of the things that I tried to do in writing this book was there's an interesting kind of slant. The story has always been told in the past in terms of the opportunities that Stax Records, that Atlantic Records, that the involvement of people like Phil and Alan Walden, the opportunities that they provided Otis, in this case, to have this career, to make these records. And at a certain point in researching and writing this book, this sort of coin dropped in the back of my mind. And I thought, how strange that we think about it in those terms, and that we don't think about it in terms of the opportunities that the musical talent of Otis Redding provided Jim Stewart at Stax, and Steve Cropper at Stax, and Jerry Wexler at Atlantic Records in New York, and Phil Walden and Alan Walden in Macon, to have these very successful careers as record executives and musicians and managers. What all of these folks have in common is that they're white. Why do we look at it in terms of the opportunities that you know what I'm saying, that they provided Otis? None of this would have happened had it not. I mean, the bottom line of all of this thing, the thing that people buy when they buy those records, is the talent of this extraordinarily determined, extraordinarily gifted young man. And so, in writing the book, I tried to sort of like keep that in the front of my mind as much as I could, and to see it in those terms. Because Otis really was he was both the author and the protagonist of his career. He was the driving force. And when you add to that the idea that he was an extraordinarily young man, he was 26 when he died, 21 when he really started a professional career in an important way, it becomes all the more impressive.
Thanks to Jonathan for the insights. You really put Otis Redding's career into perspective, and maybe gave me an understanding of why we still talk about that plane crash that took the life of Otis Redding 50 years ago. Make sure to check out his book, Otis Redding, An Unfinished Life, and don't forget to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. You can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at WisPodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.